I'd like to talk to you today about MuleSoft and the value of no-code or low-code solutions. So this is an example flow of what MuleSoft looks like. Obviously, there is no code here. This isn't a coding language. This is a no-code solution. So if you'll see, the very first connector here, these are called connectors, is a logger. And most people in software engineering are familiar with logging. You can log anything from the flow you're currently in, the value of the payload, or anything that your flow has access to at that moment. You'll see after the logger, there's a choice. Software engineers are going to be more familiar with this in the terms of if and else. This is, if you'll see, the very top here is a 2 greater than 1. That's obviously true. The transform message in that case is just, this is true is what it's titled. What it would do normally is change the message, anything that you could need for this purpose. If you want to change the value of the payload, if you want to add something completely new, if you want to update something additionally, this would all be done here. In this case, the else would never occur, obviously, but in this case, it's called a default. This is false, given the current condition. Normally, you would use some sort of conditional logic there. The slightly confusing thing, if you're coming from a software engineering background, is that the else is required. That's one kind of curiosity with MuleSoft, is that you cannot have just an if. If I'm in a software engineering background and I'm using a traditional code language, I could just do an if condition, then action, or if with action in curlies. That is not the case here. That could be kind of taken good or bad, depending on your perspective. For some people, having an if without an else might be a little confusing because that may not be how you think logically. MuleSoft does lay this out very concisely in a required fashion. So you do have to have that else, that default case. That may be something that software engineers are not familiar with, but often the people using MuleSoft are not software engineers. They may be more technical roles that don't have an engineering background, BAs, BIs, that sort of role would be very fitting for this. So after this choice occurs, you would see where we can set the payload from the payload to a variable. This is useful if you're going to make some tweaks to your payload, or if you're going to need to save something to add later or have some conditional logic later. The variable is a really good way to save that and not worry about manipulations to the payload changing kind of through your process. This is especially important with larger, more complex flows. The flow reference, again, from a software engineering background, is going to be something like a method or a subroutine call. If you want to add another flow to kind of either make things a little more clean for visibility, or if it's something that you want to modularize and make it where you can call it from any number of places, that's where you would go. So in this case, I have it simply pointing at the same flow, would be circular logic, that would be a problem. But an actual production flow, you could make this call. I've used it for parsers, I've used it for some kind of logic that I'll use multiple times. It just makes it a little cleaner, a little more easier to see. So connectors, as they're called, are basically small components, and the Mule palette is the place that you would go to find these. So there are quite a few. These are the ones that are built in by default, and there are numerous that you can import from MuleSoft's Exchange. Typically, for basic flows, you wouldn't need anything more than what is already included in the palette. And there are descriptions if you want to see exactly what one does. If you have some sort of specific integration needs, the best thing to do would be to search an Exchange and find that. And again, because it is a fairly prolific platform, tons of those are available. So this is kind of the only really complicated part of MuleSoft, is that you do have to configure these components. If you want to accomplish certain things, you do have to tell it what you want it to do. For software engineers, this is going to come really easy. This is going to be truly where you feel at home in this platform, because this is the most code-like portion. For the less technical roles, this is going to be where you maybe struggle a little bit. So what a lot of people think of with complications of API generation is the routing. And fortunately, that is one place that MuleSoft does excel. This is all generated automatically. You will create a RAML file, and for those who've heard of YAML, it's very similar. It's kind of just MuleSoft's flavor of YAML. You tell it what endpoints you want, what expectations you have for that, whether you want headers, whether you want a request body. And fortunately, the MuleSoft and 8-Point Studio can generate flows from that RAML. You never have to add any of this yourself. You just change it once it is added and make it do what you want it to do. So that part is actually really, really easy, especially for those who don't have any familiarity with writing APIs. So what are the benefits of MuleSoft? Why should you use it? First of all, it's easy. A lot of people, when you think I need to write an API package, you're going to have a software engineer. This doesn't require software engineers. It's made so that less technical roles are able to generate APIs, make them work, test them, and add that functionality to a project without having to use that software engineer role. The other benefit is that it's visual. It's GUI rather than a command line interface. This is really, really foreign to a lot of non-software engineer roles because command line is just not very friendly. It doesn't easily show you what you're capable of. As you've seen in the previous slides, the GUI is just naturally, I look in the Mule palette, I see what I want, I drag and I drop, and it's quite as simple as that. And finally, it's very quick to get something like a prototype or a proof of concept up and running without having to learn how to write code in any given language or determine exactly how to go about what you want to do. You drag and drop, and you can produce functional logic very, very quickly. So the shortcomings are efficiency. This is really, really problematic for larger, more complex issues. There are some things that are just inherently harder to do in a visual interface. And if you have a really good software engineer, they're able to write more complex logic faster in traditional code. That's kind of just the nature of the beast. And that's kind of the turning point of when do you decide to use MuleSoft rather than use some other traditional language. The environments of MuleSoft, I will confess, are a little bit finicky. It's difficult to configure an environment to use what you want to do, and it can be complicated to know where to change those configurations. The benefit is that there are quite a few forums dedicated to MuleSoft, and those do have some pretty good resources. So typically someone has encountered the same problem and that's documented somewhere, but it may be a little bit difficult to troubleshoot that and find the solution that you're looking for. So merge conflicts, and this is, again, the larger the team, the more of an issue this becomes. If you're a small team, one-man dev shop, so to speak, you're not going to have a whole lot of merge conflicts because you're the only one working in here. If you have more and more people working in the same flows, you're going to generate more and more merge conflicts, and this will become more and more of a problem. And similarly, sort of related to that, is that because MuleSoft does auto-generate code based on these connectors, sometimes the same code is not generated when you add the same connectors just because of auto-generation quirks. Version control can be very difficult, and especially when you're trying to compare what was changed in a version, it may not always be obvious just because the auto-generation doesn't really clearly indicate what was done. So should you use MuleSoft for your needs? Are you short on software engineers? Maybe. Again, this is something that can easily scale well to a BA, a BI, other moderately technical roles that have a propensity for logic but maybe don't know software engineering. This could be a useful tool. It sort of depends on your specific team and whether you have enough engineers, whether you have enough BAs. It's complicated to say. Do you use Salesforce? Then it's probably a good tool. MuleSoft is owned by Salesforce. The connector with Salesforce works really well. And so especially if you need a lot of business logic to tie into Salesforce, MuleSoft is going to do that very naturally. There are Salesforce connectors that just do that. So that's really, really useful to have that. And it's a little faster to get Salesforce integration tied in. If you already have a working API package in some other language, I would not recommend using MuleSoft. Typically, if you have an API package, then you have developers who can maintain it. You already have the proof of concept. You already have your baseline there. So there's really no need for you to make a no-code solution when you have code and you have people who can maintain the code. So that's it can be problematic to start fresh, but if you are starting over new or if you don't have the resources, it can be a really useful tool. That's about it. The safest way to get into this is to dig in, take a look at 8-Point Studio, 8-Point Platform, and just learn a little bit about MuleSoft. But depending on your needs, it could be a very, very valuable solution. And no-code, low-code isn't always the panned, useless thing that a lot of software engineers like to say. There is a value for it. It just depends on the scenario. Thank you.